Today we are going to be adding integers, and so the first set of problems that we deal with are going to ask us to add on a number line. So let's take a look at these problems. So here we're starting at -12. This is the starting number. We start with the first number here, -12, so we go on to the number line over to -12. And then it says we are adding 19. Well, if I add 19, do I go to the right or do I go to the left? Well, this is a positive 19. So I go in the positive direction. Notice that the positive direction, these are all positive numbers, is to the right. These are the positives. But the negative direction is off to the left. Those are the negatives. And so it says that I'm adding 19. So that means I need to go 19 spaces towards the positive. So I go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So now I'm back at 0. Now I got to continue going. I'm only at 12 now, I've counted. So this is 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. So I finally made it right in between 6 and 8. And that is the number 7. So this equals 7. So notice that when I'm adding 19 to -12, I had to get all the way to 0. And then I started counting up to those numbers. Well, you'll see the same sort of concept with this one, except it's a little different because I'm starting at a different type of number. I'm starting at a positive 4. So this is the starting point. So I start at 4. So I go over to 4, put the dot there. And then this time I'm adding negatives. Well, remember the positive direction is off to the right. The negative direction is off to the left. Well, if I'm adding negatives, I'm going in the negative direction. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So I made it there to -2. So 4 plus -6 equals -2. So I had to, when I added that -6 to 4, I had to get all the way through the positives to 0, and then I only had 2 more numbers left to go through into the negative direction. We ended up at -2. So in both of these problems, notice that we could have just subtracted these two numbers. See, 19 minus 12, if I subtract those, I get 7. Same thing here. Notice that if I subtract 6 minus 4, I get 2, but I have more negatives, so that's why it ended up being -2. So when I subtracted that, I got -2. And this one's a little different. So let's start here. We start at -7 on the number line, so right in between -8 and -6, and I'm adding negatives. So am I going in the positive direction? No, I'm going in the negative direction, which is to the left. So let's go that 4 spaces. 1, 2, 3, 4, right there. -11. So that's what I get. Now notice when they're the same sign, you don't have to go back towards 0. You just continue going. And notice the numbers appear to be getting bigger, but they're actually getting smaller because they're further from 0. But since they're further from 0, we're going in the negative direction. It means that we end up adding these numbers. Notice how 7 and 4, when I add them, they're both the same sign there. I ended up with -11. We're going to use that concept, but in a different visual for you here. We're taking a look at these balance scales. So the balance scale weighs positive numbers, so the positive numbers, and negative numbers. And negative numbers go to the left, as we said. So notice how I said they're going to the left, and the positives are going to the right. That's what the number line says. Well, look at this one. Find -11 plus 8. Notice that the scale is tipped towards the -11. The -11 didn't quite balance out the positive 8 because there's more negatives. There's a bunch of little negative signs here and only 8 positive signs. And so that's why the scale is tipped to the left, because there's more negatives. And notice what we do to come up with that answer. See, remember, you're starting at -11, we're adding 8, and so we're going in that positive direction. If you think of it on the number line, here's -11, we're having to go 8 spaces, but in the positive direction. So we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, but we don't quite get to 0. And so that's why they ended up at -3. See, if you subtract 11 minus 8, that makes 3. But since there's more negatives, that's why it's a negative number, because the negatives dominated here. There's more of them than the positives. Well, if we look at this one, here we have -2 plus 7. So we have 2 negatives and 7 positives. Well, these 2 negatives don't overcome these 7 positives. That's why the scale is tipped. It's tipped towards the positive numbers. And so when we come up with our answer, we end up having to subtract those two numbers. So again, if you started at -2, so here's -2, we'd end up going 1, 2, and that would get you back at 0, and then 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and that would be 5 spaces over. And so when we come up with our answer quickly, we could subtract those two numbers, and since we've got more positives than negatives, the answer is positive. That's why it's +5. Now, take a look at this one. Here we are at -1, and we have no positives. We're adding more negatives, so it's tipped towards the negative direction. So we have no positives here. And so what did we do with these two numbers? How did we come up with our answer? Well, what did they do? They ended up adding them because they're the same sign. Notice on this last one, we continued going in that negative direction. And if you draw it on a number line, if I just sketch this number line right here, and I have -1 right here, here's 0, I'm going 3 spaces, but in the negative direction. So 1, 2, 3. So that's -2, -3, -4. And so that's why I get -4 as the answer. So notice that when they're both the same sign, you end up having to add the two numbers together. That's how we ended up at -4. So let's take a look at this example over here. Here we've got 3 plus -9. And should we add or should we subtract? Well, they're opposite signs. So we're taking away some negatives to counteract these 3 positives here. So that means we end up having to subtract. And so subtract would be the right answer there. So we're going to subtract. And will the sum be positive or negative? Well, which one has more? Think of the balance scale. Here we've got our scale, and we've got some positives on one side, so there's 3 positives over here, but we've got a bunch of negatives. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 negatives on this side. So which way is it going to tip? Well, it's going to tip this way. It's going to tip towards the negative because there's more of these negatives. Now notice how these 3 positives are going to wipe out 3 of the negatives. And how many negatives are we left with? Well, we can count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So 6 negatives, and that's how I got the answer. And so when we get our answer, again, we just have -6. So should the sum be positive or negative? It'll be negative because there's more negatives. More negatives. And why did we subtract here? Well, because they're opposite. Opposite sign. Opposite sign meant that we're going to end up having to subtract those two numbers. Let's take a look at this one. -5 plus -8. Should we add or should we subtract? Well, they're the same sign, so we're going in the same direction. So we're going to end up adding. And why? Because it's the same sign. Same sign means you're going to end up adding. Will the sum be positive or negative? Well, we never make it to the positive direction. We're just going further in the negative. And so it's more negatives because the sign stays the same when we're adding two numbers. Sign stays the same when adding numbers. And what do we get when we add those two numbers? Well, just add the two numbers. 5 plus 8. What's that end up making? 13. So -13 is our answer. Well, let's use our rule here. So remember that rule. Opposite signs, we're going to subtract. Same sign, you're going to add. So add for the same sign. So let's go ahead and highlight that real quick. And so when we see those same signs, when we see these same signs here, same signs, we're going to end up adding those numbers. So same signs, add. Opposite signs, we're going to end up subtracting those numbers. That's the rule that we're going to end up using. So let's use that. -45 plus 9. So those are opposite signs. So opposite means that we're going to end up subtracting. So we do 45 minus 9. So we take away, and we end up at 36. Now, is it positive or negative? Well, which one has more? Well, there's more negatives than positives, so that one determines the sign. So -36. What do we do here? 37 plus -60. They're opposite signs. Opposite signs mean that we're going to subtract. So we do 60 minus 37. So you subtract those numbers, borrow a bit, And we end up with 23. Now, is it negative or positive? Which one has more? Well, there's more negatives, so it's negative 23. Same thing here. What are we going to do, add or subtract? Well, they're opposite signs. Opposite signs means you're going to subtract. And so you set up your subtraction problem, you borrow a bit, you do the subtraction, and we end up with 29. And so when we have 29, that means that, is it going to be positive or negative? Well, look at the numbers. We have more positives than negatives. This time it's going to be a positive 29. Well, opposite signs again, so that tells us that we're going to end up subtracting. And so we set up our subtraction problem, 95 minus 25, and we end up at 70. Well, look at the signs. More positives than negatives, so it's going to tip towards the positive number, so it's a positive 70. What are we going to do here? Add or subtract? Well, they're the same sign. So when they're the same sign, that means we're going to end up adding 79 and 15. We add those two numbers. And so here we end up with 14, carry a 1, makes 94. And is it positive or negative? Sign stays the same, so it's going to be a negative, going further in the negative direction. Opposite signs here, so we're going to end up subtracting 63 minus 49. And when we do that, we end up having to borrow a bit, we get 1 and a 14. So 14. And is it positive or negative? Well, more negatives than positives. So that means that we're going to have a negative. Same sign here. So we get to add those two numbers together this time. 49 and 47. Add those two numbers. We get 16. Carry a 1. Makes 96. Positive or negative? Well, sign stays the same when you're adding. Well, those are the rules you're going to see on tonight's homework. Good luck.